I'm John Hendrickson. I'm with the Northern Great Plains Research Lab. And just for full disclosure here, I'm not an agronomist. I'm a range scientist. I'm not saying my co-authors made me say that, but that was strongly suggested in case I said something crazy from an agronomic standpoint. But the other reason I kind of wanted to bring it up is that what I'm going to talk about today is really looking at including perennials in your crop rotation. And I'm going to not look at it. I got interested in this not so much from the agronomy, but more from the range science. And what do I mean by that? Well, I saw a statistic the other day, and it was 1.9 million acres. And what was that? That was the amount of grassland converted to cropland in the Great Plains in the US and Canada in 2022. I said, wow, that's a lot, but you can see that there is actually quite a bit of acreage that gets converted every year to from grassland to cropland. And a lot of times, a lot of that acreage has been, you look at the map with the red dots, a lot of that acreage is concentrated here in the Northern Great Plains. And really, that's probably one reason land use change has been identified as one of the major challenges to rangeland here in the Northern Great Plains. So I was thinking about that some, and I thought, what if we could flip the narrative a little bit? What if we could think more about changing from cropland back to grassland? And in order to do that, I think we need to kind of understand why this change occurred in the first place. And I'm not going to think that I have every reason, but I did identify about three, I think, that kind of hit on this subject a lot. If you look at the pictures here, you can see two different pictures. They were both taken in North Dakota. They're both doing the same thing, and they were taken 100 years apart. And the main difference between the two photos is technology. The one they're using horses, the other they're using a tractor. And I think we have technology now that we can start to convert marginal land over to cropland. We have the equipment technology, we have genetics, we have some of the management technology needed. I think that's one thing driving the conversion from grassland to cropland. Another, I think, is economics. And this graph here is a little bit hard to follow, but I'll walk you through it quick. Around the outside, there are a bunch of different attributes. And if you see the blue dot there, you can see it's where permanent grassland was compared to cropland. And if that blue dot is in the green, then it means that that permanent grassland benefited whatever attribute that was more than the cropland. And if you look around that, you can see just about every attribute, the blue dot is in the green except for yield and energy. And what do producers get paid on? Yield and energy. So we have this economic issue too that we're struggling with that's driving a lot of this conversion between grasslands to croplands. I think the last thing is necessity. And this is a picture of my dad when I don't know how old he was, but my dad and I share a birthday. And he always told me I was his best birthday present, but I'm pretty sure there were days when he wanted the vice grip stuff instead. But he grew up in a really interesting time, I think. And, he was born in 1923. And, about that time, most farms were animal powered. And they had, you couldn't just call up Cenex for a delivery of fuel. You had to grow it. And so that took a lot of acreage. There's about 93 million acres used to grow feed for livestock. And just to give you a little bit of a context, that's an area about the size of Montana. And it wasn't just marginal land. It was a lot of really pretty decent stuff. And I think another important thing here is that because so many producers had to grow this feed, that it was really kind of woven into their whole farming philosophy, that they're going to have perennials on their landscape. That was part of who they were. And when he passed away in 2007, it was really kind of a different structure. Farms were mechanized, and occasionally there would be pushes for perennials. We've heard of the soil bank and CRP, but they weren't really woven into the fabric the way that it had been earlier. So there was not the necessity to really raise have that number of perennials anymore. But what did we lose when we saw that decline in perennials on the landscape? And we've seen this soil health principles before. I think I probably stole this from Jay or Daryl, the slide here, but I think you could argue that for each of these soil health principles, that they can be improved through introducing more perennials on your landscape. And so what I'm really going to talk about a lot today is thinking about including perennials as part of your crop rotation. And what I'm going to focus a lot on, areas where, the perennials as a phase in your crop rotation. And so you have a piece where you're growing perennials on it for a while, then you're switching over to annuals, and you're switching back to perennials. And this is kind of a long-term, you have to have a lot of long-term thought with that. And I drew up some of these questions around here that people may want to be interested in if they're interested in growing more perennials. And I kind of grouped these questions into different categories because you have to think for such a long term. I kind of split them into where you were, which is what you had for the annual crop, where you are, which is where you want to be with the perennial, and where you want to go. And that's kind of going back to the annual again in this cycle. And I'm going to bring up a bunch of different projects we've done at our location that kind of help, hopefully, maybe not address the questions, but give you a little bit of insight into each of these. So the first ones I'm going to talk about is the previous annual crop and the previous annual crop rotation. So we had a scientist here, his name was Marty Smear, and he was an agronomist, and he was really kind of interested in, does the previous annual crop influence the yield of the perennials? In other words, what's the best annual crop to plant your perennial forages in? So he had these 5 different annual crops: corn, canola, soybean, wheat, dry pea, and he seeded into the residue of those 5 annual crops some different perennials mixtures. And I'm not going to talk about them all, but I'm going to pull out a couple here. And he looked at the yield of these perennials mixtures over time. And what I found interesting on this was he had a couple warm season mixtures. One was switchgrass. It really wasn't a mixture of monocrop, but switchgrass. And then he also had a warm season. He called it a moderate diversity, moderate input mixture. And the yield of those 2 mixtures were best when they were seeded into soybean plots. And that's not totally surprising because a lot of times we'll use soybeans as kind of your preparation plot for putting in perennials. You have a lot of weed control options. What I found kind of interesting was looking at, he had a couple cool season mixtures in there also. In this case, it was intermediate wheatgrass, alfalfa, and a cool season moderate diversity mixture. And in that case, the residue that he planted into that gave him the best yields was canola, which I really found kind of interesting. And the difference in yields was about 800 pounds an acre between the best and the worst. And if you look at that, that kind of gives you about every 5 acres, just choosing the previous annual crop, you can get an extra 2 tons of forage. So how about the previous crop rotation? We had Don Tanaka started a project here and called it the Soil Quality Management Project. He started in the early 90s. And basically, it focused a lot on tillage management. He had different crop rotations when he was doing this. And in 2012, there were 6 different crop rotations we looked at that were both done under no-till and minimum till. And the crop rotations were continuous spring wheat, both with and without the residue left in place, spring wheat corn cover crop rotation, spring wheat corn soybean rotation, spring wheat fallow, and spring wheat soybean. And then we had some labor logistics shortages. And so we said, to free up some more labor, we're going to plant this over to a perennial mixture in 2019. So we did that, and it was an intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa mix in 2019. And then we said, hey, we could look and see how much these previous crop rotations, how they impacted the yield of that intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa mixture. And I'm just showing you a couple dates here, but I was surprised that probably the mixture that did the best was the spring wheat corn soybean mixture. I was surprised it did well early, and except for when it was really dry in 2021, it did well later. And I thought maybe it's the last crop, but it seems like we haven't published this yet, but it seems like there's something else going on synergistically with this rotation for some reason that we are getting a little bit better yields off of that. Now, again, there's some takeaways from this, and that would be, again, it seemed like we had the best luck with the spring wheat, corn, soybean rotation. Didn't see a big impact to tillage management on the intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa yields themselves. But the difference between the least productive and the most productive plots based off the previous crop rotation was about 1,000 pounds an acre. So again, 4 acres, you're getting an extra 2 ton of forage off of that. So does the previous crop matter? In both cases, you need to think about your previous annual crop, and you also need to think a little bit about the previous annual crop rotation. So how about when we're in the perennial phase? What perennial species should we use and how long should it be? Well, we started a project in 2006, and it was kind of designed to answer 3 questions. I'm going to get to the third a little bit later. But what we did there was we had these long strips of, and you can see it there, of intermediate wheatgrass, switchgrass, alfalfa, and then a mixture of intermediate wheatgrass and alfalfa and switchgrass and alfalfa. And we also had a long strip of continuous spring wheat. Then every year, we started breaking out a fourth of that and converting it over to continuous spring wheat. So we started in 2008. In 2009, half of it ended up being in continuous spring wheat. And when it was in continuous spring wheat, we didn't add any fertilizer except for 5 pounds of starter an acre. And then in 2010, we added some more. And then in 2011, the entire thing was all into continuous spring wheat. And I did this project with multiple people, but Mark Liebig took a lot of soil samples off it here. And the first thing because we had that continuous spring wheat phase in there, he could look at the impact of perennial forages on some of these different soil quality parameters. And he found that having the perennials in there helped mitigate soil acidification, reduce bulk density, we increased the organic matter, and increased water stable aggregates. But he also found, and I found this kind of interesting, that there were differences between the perennial species we would use. So just as an example, if we added intermediate wheatgrass, either alone or with alfalfa, it ended up reducing the bulk density and increasing the organic matter compared to the alfalfa only. So the takeaway from there is, it depends on your goals, but these different mixtures can impact some of these soil quality parameters differently. And the other takeaway, Mark would look at these periodically, and he found that most treatment effects took about 4 or 5 years to really start showing up the differences in the soil quality parameters. So again, what perennial species should we use? It depends. Like I said, we had good luck with that intermediate wheatgrass alfalfa mixture. It was on a sandy soil, so that worked out well for us. But other people, depending on what they need, may have put in a different mixture. The longer, the better for the soil quality phase. It seemed like at least 4 or 5 years to get some of these advantages pulled up. So how do we go from perennials to annuals, and are there benefits to the annual crop? Well, this is a project that I did with Don Tanaka and Mark Liebig. And you look at the photo on the left there, we had put together, John Berdal and I had put together a grazing trial looking at some different intermediate wheatgrass varieties. When that was done, we said, hey, what can we do with this? And we kind of said, hey, we can look at how you can go from a perennial to an annual. So we had some different tillage systems there. You can look, there's 3, and on the photo on the right, you can see, I think all 3, the no-till is clear in the back, and then the 2 in the front, one is a heavy till, and the other is kind of a minimum till. And then we started and we seeded that whole area 1 year to soybeans, and then the next year to corn, the next year to flax, and the final year to spring wheat. And so what did we find out? Well, when we published this, I didn't include the heavy tillage on it, but between the no-till and the minimum till, you can see that at least for soybeans and spring wheat, no-till did a lot better. The corn burned up, and so we really don't have a good way to look at the impact of tillage on grain yield with the corn. And we didn't see any differences in the flax, but for the soybeans and the spring wheat, we were seeing differences using no-till of somewhere between 3 to 5 bushel an acre. And so there were some pretty substantial bushels that are just, choosing your tillage system. Now, what are some benefits, again, benefits to the subsequent annual crop? And I told you there's going to be show you the question 3, and this is that same project I talked about earlier. And again, we split this out. I want you to focus down here on the conversion to spring wheat in 2011. And that had been in an annual crop, or I'm sorry, in a perennial for about 5 years. And then after we switched that over to spring wheat, we kept it in continuous spring wheat for another 4 years, and we didn't add any fertilizer except, as I said, the 5 pounds of starter. And this is some work that Jose Franco did on this. And I'm going to show you this graph here. And the bottom part of that graph, D, is really talking about that area I showed you in 2011. If you look at that dashed line across there, that's kind of an adjusted yield for the continuous spring wheat. But what I really want you to look at is these years here. And basically what this is saying is that 3 and 4 years after we converted it over to continuous spring wheat, after it'd been 5 years in a perennial, the alfalfa, which is the solid gray, and the hash mark, which is the alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass, that's PALF IMWG on the legend there, both had yields that were not different from the fertilized spring wheat. And so basically the difference in fertilizer there is somewhere between 180 and 240 pounds an acre. And we're seeing those benefits out for 4 years after we made that conversion. So how do we go from perennials to annuals? Seems like no-till is probably that gave us the greatest yields. It's probably the hardest to convince people to, because there's gopher holes or gopher mounds out there and make it difficult. But it seems like there are benefits to the subsequent crop, both in input reduction and the slide skip. But Andrea Clemenson had done some work looking at crop quality and found that crop quality protein was greater when we put the spring wheat into alfalfa versus continuous spring wheat. So adding perennials in your crop rotation give you a benefit both for input reduction and improved crop quality. So just running through some of these benefits really quick is that, there are soil quality benefits. We talked about those. You can reduce your inputs. That's some of the work that Jose did. And Andrea pointed out the potential improvements in crop quality. So if you want to do this, what are some considerations you have to think about? Well, as we saw earlier, your selection of the last annual crop and the crop rotation that you go into matter quite a bit for the impact on your forage yield. You need to really think about having these perennials in for multiple years for any type of the benefits to accrue. When you think about selecting the perennials, there are differences in what you're getting from some of these different mixtures, and you need to really consider your goals when you're selecting those perennial mixtures. And no-till seems to be the best choice for transitioning. Now, I know we're over time, but I just want to briefly talk about a couple other things. And one is further research in this would be probably looking at crop sequence use, because I think that's something that we really haven't done. And I think there's some low-hanging fruit there, how you sequence annual crops after your perennial, and also how long do the soil benefits last. But I want to spend just 2 minutes on some additional pathways. And we've talked a lot about perennials as a phase in the crop rotation. But the one thing that I think really hurts us is this area here where we're talking about energy and yield. If you remember what I was talking about, the economics. And there may be ways that we could either maybe grow perennials and annuals together at the same time in the same area. We're also using perennials as food crops, and that might be ways that we can kind of address the issues that perennials, as far as your crop rotation, have with the economics. We're looking a little bit at this. We've had some projects here where we planted an annual crop into a perennial and tried to maintain that perennial. We see lower yields, and we're also struggling some with the herbicides, trying to fine tune the herbicide application timing and amount enough to suppress the perennial without killing it. And if you look at the photo over onto the left side is silphium. That's a crop that's being developed as a potential oilseed crop. It still has quite a ways to go, but there are some potential uses for silage. The middle photo is kernza, which is a perennial grain. And there's been quite a bit of interest in kernza, and there's some markets starting to be developed for it. But those are just some ways that some of this research may end up going in the future. So with that, I just want to make sure that, I talk about this stuff, but it's really our technical and administrative staff who do all the hard work with it. And we have summer help and graduate students who give us help. In addition, we also get a lot of feedback from our customer focus group, and we really appreciate that.